You spend half your day fighting the feeling that you are wasting your time. You walk without purpose. You stare at nothing. You let your mind drift in the shower, on the couch, while waiting for water to boil. And beneath every one of those moments, there's a quiet accusation forming in the back of your awareness. You are not producing. You are not optimizing. You are letting yourself slip. This is the modern sickness Carl Jung would have recognized immediately, though he would have named it differently. He would have called it a dissociation from the unconscious, a refusal to let the psyche do what it was designed to do. When you stop forcing it to perform, the guilt you feel when you are not visibly productive is not a neutral emotion. It is not a natural response to rest. It is the voice of your persona. It's a part of you that has internalized what the world values and has mistaken that for what you are. The persona is the mask you show to others, the constructed self that earns approval, money, recognition. It is necessary. But when it becomes the only part of you that you listen to, you begin to starve the deeper structures of your mind. You begin to treat the unconscious as though it were dead weight. You begin to believe that anything not immediately legible as achievement is time lost. And that belief creates a split in you, a fracture. You become alienated from the very source of insight, originality. In Transformation, Jung wrote extensively about the creative process. And at the center of his theory was something he called incubation. Incubation is not passivity. It is not laziness. It is the second phase of creative work. It's a phase that happens when you stop applying conscious effort and allow the problem to descend into the unconscious. You gather the material, you study the problem, you immerse yourself, and then you step away. Not because you have given up, but because the conscious mind has done all it can. The rest of the work that connects seemingly unrelated ideas, that finds the hidden pattern that brings the solution up from the depths like a lotus rising through dark water. That happens outside your awareness. It happens in the liminal space between waking thought and dream. It happens when you are staring out a window, when you are walking without direction, when you are doing nothing that looks like work, but you have been trained to distrust that process. You have been taught that the mind is a machine and that if you are not feeding it tasks, it is idle. That is not how the psyche works. The psyche is not a factory. It does not stop when you stop. It reorganizes. It makes meaning. It integrates, and it does this most effectively when you are not watching it. When you are not interfering with it, when you have released your need to control the outcome. Jung understood this. He called it active imagination. Process through which the unconscious is allowed to express itself without the ego stepping in to censor, direct, or evaluate. Active imagination was not just a therapeutic technique. It was a recognition that the psyche has its own intelligence, its own logic, and that the conscious mind must learn to get out of its way. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what Jung intuited. The default mode network, a collection of brain regions that activate when you are not focused on external tasks. It's now understood to be causally linked to creative thinking. When you stop concentrating, when you let your mind wander, this network begins to fire. It searches through your memory. It forms associations. It connects distant concepts. And it does so in ways that your focused, task-oriented mind cannot. Studies have shown that people who engage in low-demand activities during breaks, activities that allow for mind wandering, perform significantly better on creative tasks than those who remain cognitively engaged. The undemanding task, the blank stare, the aimless walk, these are not interruptions to the creative process. They are essential components of it, but you have been conditioned to see them as failures. You have absorbed the cultural message that every moment must be accounted for, that rest must be earned. That downtime is only permissible if it can be justified as self-care or recovery or strategic renewal. You cannot simply stop. You cannot simply exist without a reason. And so even when you do rest, you do it with guilt. You do it while scrolling through productivity advice. You do it while planning the next task. You do it while silently calculating how much time you are wasting and whether you will be able to make it up later. This is not rest. This is the persona pretending to rest while still maintaining control. The shadow, the part of you that you have disowned, is the part that knows how to do nothing without justification. The shadow is what you call unproductive when you are afraid of it. It is the impulse to wander, the curiosity that has no clear application, the thought that leads nowhere useful, the moment of stillness that feels uncomfortable because it is not moving you toward a goal. You have learned to suppress it because the world does not reward it. But suppression is not the same as elimination. The shadow does not disappear. It waits. And when you refuse to engage with it consciously, it finds other ways to express itself. It shows up as restlessness, as burnout, as the feeling that even when you are accomplishing things, you are somehow still failing. Integration is the process. Jung described as bringing the shadow into conscious relationship with the ego, not as something to be defeated or controlled, but as something to be understood and included. When you integrate the shadow, you stop treating unproductive time as a moral failing. You stop trying to extract value from every moment. You stop performing rest and start actually resting. And paradoxically, that is when the creative work begins. That is when the unconscious has space to move. That is when the insight arrives, not because you forced it, but because you allowed it. The problem is that you have been taught to mistake activity for productivity and productivity for meaning. You have been told that if you are not visibly doing something, you are falling behind. And that belief has colonized even your interior life. You cannot let your mind be still without feeling that you are wasting potential. You cannot sit with an unresolved question without immediately reaching for distraction or structure. You cannot tolerate the discomfort of not knowing what you are doing or why. And so you fill every gap. You schedule every hour. You turn rest into a task and stillness into a strategy. You lose access to the very thing that makes original thought possible. You lose access to the unconscious. Jung believed that the unconscious was not just a repository of repressed material. It was a creative force. It was where new thoughts emerged, where solutions formed, where the psyche reorganized itself in response to the challenges you could not solve with conscious effort alone. He used the metaphor of the lotus to describe how creativity arises from the depths, how it grows in darkness and emerges into light without the ego having directed its growth. But for that process to happen, you have to be willing to let go. You have to be willing to trust that the mind is working even when you are not. You have to be willing to tolerate the feeling of doing nothing, the feeling that others might interpret as laziness, the feeling that your persona has learned to fear. Discipline in this context is not the discipline of constant output. It is the discipline of restraint. It is the ability to step back from the problem, to let the question sit, to resist the urge to force an answer before it is ready. This is harder than it sounds. It requires you to go against everything the modern world tells you about success. It requires you to sit with uncertainty. It requires you to accept that not all valuable work looks like work. It requires you to stop equating your worth with your productivity. And that is terrifying for most people because it means letting go of the persona's primary defense. The belief that if you are always doing something, you are safe from judgment. But safety and creativity are not compatible. Creativity requires risk. It requires you to descend into the unconscious, to engage with material that has not yet been organized into something presentable, to work with thoughts that are still formless, still contradictory, still strange. Jung called this the descent into the depths. It is not a metaphor, it is a psychological process. It is what happens when you stop managing your mind and start listening to it. And it happens most reliably in the moments you have been taught to dismiss. The blank stare, the shower thought, the walk without a destination. These are not distractions from the work. These are the work. You are not wasting time when you let your mind wander. You are allowing the default mode network to activate, to search through semantic space, to make connections between ideas that are too distant for focused attention to reach. You are giving the unconscious permission to solve the problem you could not solve by thinking harder. You are practicing the kind of cognitive flexibility that innovation requires. And you are doing it in the only way it can be done, by getting out of your own way. But you have been conditioned to believe that getting out of your own way is the same as giving up. You've been told that discipline means never stopping, that mastery means constant effort, that the only way to achieve anything is to push through discomfort and exhaustion until you break through to the other side. And sometimes that is true, but not always. Not when the problem requires a different kind of thinking. Not when the solution is not something you can reach by force. Not when the creative insight depends on letting go rather than holding on. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is the condition under which the unconscious can speak. When you are constantly filling your mind with input, with tasks, with noise, you drown out the quieter signals. You lose the ability to hear what your own psyche is trying to tell you. This is why so many breakthroughs happen in the shower, in the car, in the middle of the night. It is not that those moments are magical. It is that they are the only moments when you have stopped talking long enough to listen. The psyche is always working, but you are not always paying attention. And when you finally do pay attention, when you finally stop demanding that your mind produce something measurable, that is when the insight arrives. Not because you earned it, but because you made space for it. Other people will not understand this. They will see your stillness and interpret it as laziness. They will see your lack of visible progress and assume you are not working. This is projection. They are looking at you through the lens of their own fear, their own belief that value is only created through constant effort. And their discomfort with your stillness is a reflection of their own inability to tolerate it in themselves. You do not need to defend yourself to them. You do not need to justify your process. You do not need to perform productivity to earn their approval. What you need is the inner authority to know that your psyche has its own rhythm, its own method, and that trusting it is not a failure of discipline. It is the discipline. The mirror effect is what happens when you stop reacting to their projection. When you stop internalizing their judgment, when you stop letting their discomfort dictate your behavior, they become uncomfortable precisely because you are not reflecting their anxiety back at them. You are modeling something they cannot yet access in themselves. The ability to rest without guilt. The ability to trust the process without needing to control it. The ability to let the mind do what it is designed to do without forcing it into shapes that look like productivity. And that makes them confront their own refusal to do the same. This is not your responsibility to fix, but it is useful to understand. Because when you understand it, you stop taking their reactions personally. You stop believing that their discomfort means you are doing something wrong. Jung spent years studying the relationship between the conscious and unconscious mind. And one of his central insights was that the psyche is always striving toward wholeness. It is always trying to integrate what has been split off, to bring into awareness what has been hidden, to balance what has become one-sided. When you treat unproductive time as worthless, you create a one-sided consciousness. You align yourself entirely with the persona, with the part of you that performs. And you exile the shadow, the part of you that simply is. And the psyche will not tolerate that exile indefinitely. It will force you to confront it. Through burnout, through creative block, through the vague but persistent sense that even when you are doing everything right, something is missing. What is missing is the relationship with the unconscious. What is missing is the willingness to let the psyche unfold in its own time, according to its own logic. What is missing is the trust that not all valuable work happens in the light of conscious attention. Some of it happens in the dark. Some of it happens slowly. Some of it happens when you are not looking. And if you cannot tolerate that, if you cannot make peace with the fact that creativity does not always look like progress, then you will spend your entire life fighting the very process that could transform you. Responsibility, in this context, is not the responsibility to produce more. It is the responsibility to honor the full complexity of your psyche, to stop treating rest as something that must be earned, to stop seeing stillness as a sign of weakness, to stop forcing the creative process into a linear model that denies the reality of how insight actually emerges. It is the responsibility to recognize that the mind has its own intelligence and that your job is not to micromanage it, but to create the conditions under which it can do what it does best. And those conditions include time that looks like nothing, time that feels unproductive, time that does not justify itself with measurable results. You are afraid that if you stop pushing, everything will fall apart. You are afraid that rest is a slippery slope, that if you let yourself stop for a moment, you will never start again. But that fear is the persona speaking. It is the part of you that believes your worth is contingent on your output. And it is lying to you. Because the truth is that you cannot sustain creative work without rest. You cannot access the unconscious without stillness. You cannot integrate the shadow without allowing space for what does not fit into your carefully managed identity. The psyche does not work on demand. It works in cycles. And if you refuse to honor those cycles, you do not become more productive. You become more fragmented. The path forward is not more discipline in the sense of more control. It is disciplined in the sense of fidelity to the process. It is the willingness to trust that the blank stare, the aimless walk, the moment when you are doing nothing that looks like work, is actually the moment when the deepest work is happening. It is the willingness to stop performing and start being, to stop managing and start listening, to stop treating your mind like a tool that exists to serve your goals and start recognizing it as something larger than you. Something with its own wisdom, something that knows how to solve problems you cannot solve by thinking harder. This is not easy. It goes against everything you have been taught. It requires you to tolerate discomfort. It requires you to sit with the fear that you are wasting time. It requires you to resist the urge to fill every gap with something measurable. But it is the only way to access the kind of creativity that matters. The kind that is not just recombination of existing ideas, but genuine transformation. The kind that does not come from effort alone, but from the integration of effort and surrender, consciousness and unconsciousness. Doing and being. You will know you are doing it right when the guilt begins to fade, when the stillness stops feeling like failure, when you can let your mind wander without immediately pulling it back to something useful, when you can sit with a question without needing to answer it right away, when you can trust that the psyche is working even when you are not. That is when the lotus begins to rise. That is when the insight emerges. That is when the creative process, the real creative process, The one Jung spent his life studying finally has room to unfold. Not because you forced it, but because you allowed it